I've often found that success doesn't truly measure itself in zeros on a bank statement. It's in the quiet moments when you're alone with your thoughts, reflecting on the winding path that brought you here. I suppose that's why I found myself standing in front of the old factory building in Green Hill. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. It hadn't changed much since I was a boy cleaning floors here, only now it seemed even smaller, shabbier, like a relic of a time I'd almost left behind. I used to be just another face in the crowd, another invisible worker sweeping the endless dirt and dust that seemed to seep through every crack in the walls. Back then, I wasn't Patrick, the millionaire, the successful entrepreneur. I was just Patrick, the cleaner, the kid who'd show up before dawn and leave long after the sun had set, hands blistered and clothes stained with the grime of other people's lives. But those long hours, those grueling days, were where I learned what it meant to fight for something. To have nothing but a dream and the stubbornness to keep pushing when everyone else had given up. I was the son of a woman who taught me that we were meant for more, that we could rise above our circumstances if we just kept our heads down and worked harder than anyone else. I could still remember the smell of the factory, a mix of metal, sweat, and hopelessness. It was where I first started saving every penny I could, dreaming of something better, something more. The old man who ran the place was as rough as they came, but he had a soft spot for a kid with ambition. He let me take on extra shifts, paid me under the table when times got tough, and always told me to keep my eyes on the prize. And I did. I never lost sight of the future I wanted, no matter how impossible it seemed. I saved enough to take night classes, got myself a degree, and slowly worked my way up the corporate ladder. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't always pretty, but I did it. I made it out. I became the man I am today. But standing here, looking at that old building, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. I had everything I ever wanted: money, power, respect. But there was a hollowness in my chest that I couldn't quite explain. Maybe that's why I found myself here, searching for something I'd lost along the way, something that couldn't be bought or earned through hard work alone. It was a strange feeling, being back here. I hadn't planned on it, really. I was just driving through the old neighborhood, taking a trip down memory lane, when I spotted the factory. And before I knew it, I was parked out front, staring at the ghost of my past. As I stood there, lost in thought, I heard a voice call out to me. "Patrick? Is that you?" I turned to see an old woman hobbling toward me. She was small, her back bent with age, her clothes tattered and worn. But there was something familiar about her. Something that made my heart skip a beat. "Mrs. Williams?" I asked, disbelief coloring my tone. She smiled, though it was a sad smile, and nodded. "You remember me. After all these years. How could I forget?" Mrs. Williams had been a fixture in my childhood, a kind soul who had always looked out for me and my mother when things were at their worst. She'd been our neighbor, living in the tiny apartment next to ours, and she'd saved us more times than I could count. When we couldn't afford to eat, she brought us food. When my mother was sick and couldn't work, she took care of her. When I was at my lowest, convinced that I'd never escape the life I was born into, she was the one who told me to keep going, to never give up. And here she was, all these years later, looking like life had beaten her down one too many times. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice thick with emotion. "I thought you moved away." She shook her head, her eyes tired and weary. "I never left, Patrick. Just got better at blending into the background, I suppose." There was something in her tone, something that made my chest tighten. I could see the struggle in her eyes, the pain she was trying to hide. And suddenly, I felt ashamed. I'd spent so long climbing my way to the top that I hadn't stopped to think about the people I'd left behind. "Mrs. Williams, are you okay?" I asked, the words feeling inadequate as they left my lips. She hesitated, then shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "No, Patrick, I'm not. I'm not okay at all." And in that moment, I knew. I knew that whatever brought me back here, whatever lingering doubt had led me to this place, it wasn't just about me. It was about her. It was about making things right. I led Mrs. Williams to a nearby cafe, one of the few places still open in this part of town. It wasn't much, just a small, run-down joint with flickering neon lights and worn-out booths, but it was quiet, and that's what we needed. We sat across from each other, the years and the weight of our respective struggles creating a chasm between us that I desperately wanted to bridge. I watched as she wrapped her frail hands around the cup of tea I'd ordered for her, her fingers trembling slightly. It pained me to see her like this, a far cry from the strong, resilient woman who'd once been the cornerstone of my world. "I can't believe it's really you," I said, breaking the silence that had settled between us. "After all these years." She smiled faintly, but there was a sadness in her eyes that she couldn't hide. "Time changes us all, Patrick. Some more than others." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just nodded. My mind was racing with questions, with memories of the past, and with the gnawing guilt that I hadn't done more to keep in touch, to ensure that she was okay. "How's your mother?" she asked suddenly, and I could see the genuine concern in her eyes. I swallowed hard, the familiar ache of loss rising in my chest. "She passed away a few years ago." Mrs. Williams's face fell. "I'm so sorry, Patrick. She was a good woman." "She was," I agreed, my voice thick. "She never forgot what you did for us, you know. She talked about you all the time." We fell into silence again, and I could see that she was struggling with something she wasn't sure she should say. I leaned forward, trying to bridge the gap between us, to show her that she could trust me. "Mrs. Williams, please," I said softly. "Tell me what's going on. How can I help?" She hesitated, then finally let out a heavy sigh, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world had finally become too much to bear. "It's my granddaughter, Nora. She's not well." The name hit me like a punch to the gut. I remembered Nora, a bright-eyed little girl with a smile that could light up the darkest room. She'd been just a toddler the last time I saw her, always clinging to her grandmother's side, full of life and laughter. "What happened?" I asked, dread curling in my stomach. Mrs. Williams's eyes filled with tears. "She was attacked, Patrick. Years ago. Some monster hurt her, and she never recovered. The surgery they did, it was botched. She's been bedridden ever since. I've been taking care of her, but it's gotten so hard." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" "I would have." She shook her head, cutting me off. "I didn't want to be a burden. You've done so well for yourself, Patrick. I didn't want to drag you back into this mess." But I could see the truth in her eyes. She hadn't reached out because she was ashamed, because she felt like she'd failed, like she didn't deserve help after all these years. And that realization broke my heart. "Mrs. Williams, you were never a burden," I said, my voice firm. "You saved me and my mother when we had nothing. You kept us alive when no one else would. If anything, I owe you everything." She looked down at her hands, silent tears slipping down her cheeks. I reached across the table and took her hand in mine, the skin paper-thin and cold. "I'm going to help you," I promised. "Whatever it takes, I'm going to make sure Nora gets the care she needs. I'll make sure you both have everything you need." She looked up at me then, her eyes filled with gratitude and something else, hope. And in that moment, I knew that this was why I'd come back, why I'd found myself standing in front of that old factory after all these years. It wasn't about me. It was about her. It was about making things right. It didn't take long for me to get the ball rolling. I had connections now, people who owed me favors, people who knew how to get things done. Within days, I'd arranged for a top specialist to assess Nora's condition, something Mrs. Williams had been trying to do for years but could never afford. I insisted on visiting them at their apartment, the same tiny, cramped place I remembered from my childhood. It was worse than I'd imagined. The walls were peeling, the furniture threadbare, and the air thick with the smell of stale despair. But the worst part was seeing Nora. She was lying in a bed that took up most of the small living room, her body thin and frail, her once bright eyes dull with pain and exhaustion. She barely looked like the little girl I remembered. My chest tightened with a mix of guilt and anger, and I had to force myself to stay calm, to keep my emotions in check. "Hi, Nora," I said softly as I approached her bed. "Do you remember me?" "It's Patrick." She turned her head slowly, her eyes searching mine, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if she did remember. But then she smiled, just a little, and it was like a flicker of the old Nora broke through the clouds of pain. "Patrick," she whispered, her voice weak. "You're big now." I chuckled, though it came out more like a choke. "Yeah, I guess I am." Mrs. Williams hovered nearby, worry etched into every line of her face. I could see how much this was killing her, how much she wanted to be strong for her granddaughter but was barely holding it together. "Patrick's going to help us," she told Nora, her voice trembling with emotion. "He's going to make everything better." Nora nodded slightly, but I could see the doubt in her eyes, the disbelief that anything could ever be better. And that broke me more than anything. The specialist arrived soon after, and I stayed with Mrs. Williams in the kitchen while he examined Nora. She was quiet, her hands twisting nervously in her lap, and I could see that she was afraid. Afraid of what the doctor might say, afraid of hoping for something better only to have those hopes dashed. When the doctor finally emerged, his expression was serious, but there was a glimmer of something positive there. "She's been through a lot," he said, his voice gentle. "But there's hope. With the right care, with proper physical therapy and maybe some corrective surgery, we could see significant improvement. It won't be easy, and it won't be quick, but it's possible." Mrs. Williams let out a sob of relief, covering her mouth with her hand as tears streamed down her face. I felt a surge of determination, a renewed sense of purpose. I'd started this journey thinking it was about paying back a debt, about doing the right thing. But now, it was more than that. It was about giving them both a chance at a life they thought they'd lost. Over the next few weeks, things moved quickly. Nora was admitted to a private hospital where she received the best care possible. I made sure Mrs. Williams had everything she needed: new clothes, a comfortable place to stay, even a nurse to help her while Nora was in the hospital. I spared no expense because I knew no amount of money could ever truly repay the debt I owed them. But it wasn't just about the money. I found myself visiting the hospital every day, spending hours with Nora, talking to her, listening to her stories, and just being there. At first, she was quiet, withdrawn, as if she didn't quite believe that things could get better. But slowly, she started to open up, to trust that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a dream. I found myself looking forward to those visits more than anything else in my life. It was strange, the way things had changed. I'd started this journey to make amends for the past, but somewhere along the way, it had become about something more. About building a future, about finding something I hadn't even known I was missing. And then, one day, as I sat by Nora's bed, she looked at me with those big, bright eyes, the eyes that had once been so full of life and were slowly, surely, regaining their spark, and she said something that stopped me cold. "Patrick," she said, her voice soft but steady, "why are you doing all this?" The question caught me off guard. I opened my mouth to answer, to say something about repaying kindness or doing the right thing, but the words wouldn't come. Because the truth was, I wasn't sure anymore. It wasn't just about repaying a debt. It wasn't just about doing the right thing. It was about her. About how much she'd come to mean to me, how much I wanted to see her smile, to see her walk again, to see her live the life she deserved. I care about you, Nora," I said finally, the words feeling inadequate but true. "I care about you a lot." She smiled then, a real smile, and for the first time, I saw hope in her eyes. Not just the hope of getting better, but the hope of something more. And in that moment, I realized that maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new. Something neither of us had expected, but both desperately needed. And as I sat there, holding her hand, I knew that this journey, this chapter of my life, was only just beginning. If you like this story, please subscribe, like, click the bell, and leave a comment. Thank you in advance.